The sun burned low over the Cimarron plains, casting long, golden shadows across a stretch of land that had once been full of laughter. Now the only sound was wind whistling through broken boards, and silence where voices used to live. The homestead had been stripped bare, fences torn down, the chicken coop empty, the barn smoldering, and on the front porch of a leaning, dust-colored house sat a woman with shorn hair, her arms wrapped around the youngest of 10 children, her eyes staring far past the horizon. Her name was Lydia Ray Lark, once known around the settlement as the Strong One, the reliable woman, the loyal wife, the mother who could carry twins in one arm and still bake 3 loaves of bread before noon. But now she was something else. She was a widow. She was a woman who had been punished for her dignity, and she was the only thing standing between her children and a world that had tried to erase them. It had happened 3 nights earlier. They had come without warning. 3 men in dusters, their faces half covered, their reasons never explained. Her husband, Clyde, had tried to reason with them. He never got the chance. They took food, burned their wagon, tore through their things like it meant nothing. And before they rode off into the darkness, they held Lydia down and cut her long, braided hair at the scalp. A cruel act, not for fashion, not for gain, but to shame her, to say, "You are nothing now." Then they left her and the children, 10 in total, the youngest barely walking, without water, without food, with a fire dying in the stove and no hope in the air. But they made one mistake. They left Lydia alive. And Lydia Ray Lark didn't know how to die quietly. 3 days passed. She scavenged what little she could, dug with her bare hands for the root cellar that hadn't been touched, boiled what was left of the rainwater, sat each child down and made them eat in shifts. But it was running out. The strength, the food, the will, and then came the 4th morning. A horse's hooves broke the silence. One, not a gang, just one. Slow, steady, deliberate. A man on a black horse crested the ridge just past the far fence post, his silhouette cutting through the morning light like a shadow made real. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, dark coat, and carried no flag of mercy or intent. But Lydia stood up anyway, because the fire in her wasn't gone. It was just waiting for someone to believe she was worth saving. He dismounted slow, eyes on her, hands away from his holsters. He was tall, older than most, with lines around his eyes that said he'd seen too much, and a stillness that made the air feel safer somehow. "I'm not here to take anything," he said, voice calm as creek water. Lydia's throat was dry, but her words were clear. "Good, because we have nothing left." He looked over the broken yard, the hungry children watching from behind her skirts. Then his gaze returned to her, specifically to her shaved head, her dirt-streaked face, and her shoulders, still square. "You still have your dignity," he said, "and that's enough to fight for." She blinked. "Who are you?" she asked. He tipped his hat. "Name's Jonah Calhoun. Folks used to call me a gunslinger. And now?" He looked past her, toward the smoldering barn, the broken fence, the injustice carved into the land like a wound. "Now," he said, "I teach people what justice really means." Jonah Calhoun didn't speak much after that. He simply stepped from his horse, unsaddled with practiced hands, and tied the reins gently to a post that had somehow remained standing. Lydia watched him the way a mother wolf watches the dark, wary but alert, ready to protect, even if her bones were cracking. The children huddled at the door, quiet as mice, too afraid to ask questions and too hungry to pretend not to stare. Jonah walked past them, slow, without stepping too close. He went to the well, worked the dry pump once, twice. Nothing. Then, without a word, he knelt beside it and began clearing the debris around the base. Dried brush, old ash, splinters of a broken bucket. He didn't ask permission. He simply helped. Lydia didn't know what to make of it. Most men who passed through were either beggars or opportunists. This one didn't ask for food, didn't offer pity. He just acted. By sundown, the well was running again. Weak, but running. Enough to fill one old basin, enough to wash the children's faces. Jonah repaired the chicken coop door with salvaged wood and fixed the front step where her eldest had nearly tripped the day before. That night, Lydia invited him to sit by the porch. She didn't thank him, not yet, and he didn't expect her to. She simply poured him a tin cup of boiled chicory, and they drank in silence. "You got a reason for being here?" she asked finally, voice low. Jonah nodded. "Had business west of here. Took a wrong turn, or maybe the right one." She gave him a look, sharp, skeptical. "You think this looks like a place for good luck?" He met her gaze evenly. "No, I think this looks like a place that needs someone who remembers what right and wrong used to mean." She swallowed hard at that. Then she asked the question that had been burning inside her since the moment he arrived. You see what they did to me? Jonah didn't look away. I see a woman who's still standing. That's what I see. No pity, no shock, just truth. And somehow that was harder to hold than tears. The children slept in shifts that night, too used to hunger to settle deeply. Lydia sat near the fire with a rifle across her lap, not because she didn't trust Jonah, but because the world had already taught her not to trust anyone too fast. Jonah slept just outside the house, beside the porch post, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of old tobacco and campfire. He didn't ask for shelter, didn't offer his past, but before he closed his eyes, he said one thing that changed everything. I saw the tracks, he murmured into the quiet. 3 riders heading east, fast, reckless. Lydia stiffened. You going after them? She asked, almost daring him. He turned his face toward the stars. I will, but not yet. Why not? Because your kids are still hungry. And you... He paused. You need someone to remind you you're not alone. Lydia didn't speak. She just tightened her grip on the rifle, then slowly loosened it. For the first time since the men rode off, she allowed herself to breathe. Just a little. Because maybe justice wasn't only a bullet. Maybe it was also a man showing up and not leaving. The next morning, Lydia awoke to the smell of smoke, but not the kind that brought back nightmares. This was the comforting kind. Wood burning slow, pan hissing with bacon she hadn't had in weeks, and something she thought she'd never feel again. Safety. Jonah was already up, working over the fire. Somehow he'd traded something, what, she didn't know, for meat and cornmeal. Maybe at the trading post 3 miles east. Maybe with someone who still remembered his name. The children came out slow, cautious. They lined up behind Lydia, watching as he divided the food onto old tin plates, then passed them out without speaking like a preacher offering communion. He saved hers for last, placed it gently in her hands. Lydia blinked down at the plate. You didn't have to. Jonah gave the smallest shrug. Didn't do it because I had to. Then he handed her something else, a comb. Wooden, simple, smooth. And for a moment Lydia stood frozen, because no one had handed her a comb since before they'd shorn her hair. Since before someone decided to take her dignity with a knife and call it justice. Her fingers trembled. She accepted it, said nothing. But the weight of it, the thought behind it, was almost too much to hold. That day Jonah stayed. He taught her eldest, Caleb, how to set snares, taught Ruth how to mend a saddle, let the younger children sit near him while he whittled small animals from scrap wood. And he never once tried to fix her. He didn't ask about the scars, didn't question why she flinched at loud sounds, didn't talk about the past unless she brought it up first. That evening, Lydia finally asked what had been gnawing at her since he arrived. What kind of man rides into someone else's ruin and stays? Jonah paused, sharpening his knife slowly by the fire. The kind who's seen his share of ruin, he said, eyes never leaving the blade, and didn't like what it made him. She studied him in the flickering light, how his shoulders curved slightly inward, like he carried something invisible but heavy. You lost someone? She asked. He nodded once. Long time ago? Wife and son? Different kind of violence? Same kind of cruelty? She looked down. I'm sorry. He met her gaze then, calm but honest. You don't have to be. Just don't waste what's still standing. She didn't realize until later that night what he meant, because survival wasn't just waking up. It was choosing to try again, to cook, to brush your hair, no matter how little was left, to kiss your children goodnight, even if your hands still shook, to say thank you to a man who didn't ask for it, but earned it all the same. That night, Lydia combed her own hair, what remained of it, and for the first time in days, she wept. Not from pain, but because some part of her still believed. And that, she realized, was what they couldn't take. A week passed, then another. Jonah never claimed a room inside the house, but he became part of it in every way that mattered. He repaired the broken door frame with care, rebuilt the barn wall so it would stand through winter. He taught the boys to fish and the girls to ride without fear. When the sun set, he ate by the fire with the family as if he'd always been there, quiet, steady, unshakable. But Lydia was changing too. She no longer watched the horizon in dread. She started planting again, radishes, turnips, herbs she remembered from her mother's kitchen. She laughed once, just once, but Jonah caught it. And he didn't say a word, just smiled behind his cup like it was a sound he'd never expected to hear again. Then came the man from Elmsford. His name was Tomlin Crane, a ranch foreman who'd ridden up on Lydia's land with 2 other men dressed well, acting important, reins too tight in their hands. Word around is you're taking in strays, he said, nodding toward Jonah. Lydia stood tall, children watching from the porch, arms crossed. He's not a stray. He's a friend. Tomlin's mouth curled. Funny thing about friends, they attract trouble when they've got blood on their name. Jonah didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood a few paces behind her, eyes steady. Whatever he's done helping me rebuild what men like you stood by and watched burn, Lydia said clearly, voice not trembling like it used to. Tomlin sneered. Just don't forget, Ms. Lark, justice comes in different forms, and it don't always wait for an invitation. He turned and rode off, dust kicking behind him like a threat. That night the fire was quieter. Jonah sat alone outside, sharpening a blade more out of habit than need. Lydia approached, arms wrapped around herself, unsure if she should say anything. He was talking about the bounty, Jonah said before she could open her mouth. There's a bounty on you? There was, still might be. I stopped counting. She took a breath. Why? He looked into the fire. Because once I thought revenge and justice were the same thing. Turns out one ends in fire, the other in peace. You think we're safe here? I think no one's safe until someone draws a line. He turned to her then, the flames reflected in his eyes. You don't owe me protection, Lydia. And you don't owe me your silence, she answered softly. He nodded. Then maybe it's time I finish what I started. The next morning, Jonah left. He said nothing more than, watch the fence lines. Keep the fire low at night. I'll be back when it's done. He didn't say what it was, but Lydia knew. Because sometimes justice doesn't knock. Sometimes it rides back out into the wild with purpose in its boots and a promise resting on its shoulders. But before he left, he did one thing more. He handed Lydia a folded slip of paper. I wrote this the night I first saw you still standing. When she opened it, the words were simple. You are not broken. You are fire, and fire survives. Jonah rode alone. The plains stretched out before him, dry, windswept, and familiar in a way he hadn't wanted to feel again. Towns like Elmsford had a shine on the surface. Clean storefronts, painted signs, men tipping their hats to ladies and preaching order with their mouths while their hands stayed dirty. He knew the type, because he'd once been the type, and that was why he couldn't let it lie. Tomlin Crane wasn't just some ranch hand with a sneer. He was tied to the men who'd ridden onto Lydia's land. Jonah had recognized the brand on his saddle, a broken spur. It had belonged to a group that once passed for a posse, but answered to no law but coin and cruelty. He'd tangled with them years back, when he was still riding for revenge, before he learned that some bloodshed only planted more ghosts. But this was different. This was justice. Not for himself, not anymore. For Lydia, for her children, for the look in her eyes the night she found the courage to speak. Elmsford came into view under a pale sky, the rooftops lined with smoke from hearths not earned. Jonah dismounted before reaching the main street. He didn't need an entrance. He needed clarity. The saloon was quiet at this hour. 3 men inside, 1 behind the bar, 2 near the back table, whiskey, cards, boots up like they owned the place. They didn't see him until he stood at the door. Didn't recognize him until he said a name. Friendly? One of the men stiffened, turned slow. He had the same face Jonah remembered. A few more scars, but the same cold smirk. The one he wore the night they rode through the Lark homestead and laughed as they lit the barn. You're alive, Friendly said, voice dry. Jonah stepped forward. You're still riding under Crane? Crane pays well. Jonah didn't flinch. And for what? Burning farms? Starving women? Cutting off a mother's hair like it's sport? Brenly stood. The saloon went still. You coming here to die, Calhoun? No, Jonah said softly. I came to remind you some people still answer for what they do. Then, calm as a shadow, Jonah laid his badge on the table. An old U.S. Marshal's badge, scratched, dull, but still real. I may not wear it anymore, he said, but the truth still holds. Brenly lunged. Too late. Jonah's hand moved like wind. Not fast, but final. He didn't draw to kill. He drew to stop. A single shot into the shoulder, another into the leg, non-lethal, precise, enough to make a point. When the sheriff came running, breathless and pale, Jonah handed over a letter, signed by a circuit judge from 3 counties back. I've been carrying this too long, he said. They're yours now. See that they're judged proper. The sheriff looked at him, stunned. Why now? Jonah adjusted his hat, turned toward the door. Because someone back there is rebuilding something better. And I won't let this world burn her down again. He rode out of Elmsford before sundown, not as a gunslinger, not as a lawman, just as a man who had finally finished the circle. Back at the homestead, Lydia stood at the gate with her hand on the comb he'd given her, and when she saw him coming over the ridge, she didn't run, didn't cry. She just smiled, because she'd always known he'd return. The children saw him first. Jonah, dark silhouette on the hill, riding steady through the soft afternoon wind. They called for Lydia, voices high and full of something she hadn't heard from them in weeks. Joy, She stepped out onto the porch, apron dusted with flour, her hair, short but growing, neatly brushed back. Her heart beat fast, not with fear this time, but with a strange calm that felt like hope returning. Jonah dismounted just beyond the fence and walked the rest of the way in. No dramatics, no boasting, just a man coming home to where he'd left a promise. "Did you find them?" Lydia asked as they stood near the porch, the sun dipping lower behind him. "I did," he said. "Are they—" "They'll stand trial," he replied. "Won't be able to ride or raise a hand for a long while." She studied his face for a long moment. "You didn't kill them." He shook his head. "Not this time." "Why not?" He looked toward the barn they'd rebuilt together, the smoke rising from the chimney, the laughter of her children chasing chickens across the yard. "Because I found something better to protect than rage." Lydia didn't say anything right away. She just stepped aside. "You hungry?" Jonah smiled. "Always." That night, the table was full. The children sat closer. The food stretched further. Laughter came easier. And Jonah took the chair closest to Lydia like he belonged there, and like no one could argue otherwise. After the meal, they sat on the porch again. Just the two of them. The stars blinked into view, and the wind carried the scent of warm bread and earth turning soft again. "I never thanked you," Lydia said at last, voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't need to." "I do." She looked at him fully then, eyes fierce but gentle. "You didn't just protect us. You reminded me I was still me." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "And who's that?" "A woman worth fighting beside, not for." Jonah looked at her, really looked. "You've always been that." Lydia took a breath, her fingers resting gently on the comb in her apron pocket. "I'm not asking for anything more," she said. "Not promises, not someday." "I know," he said, "but I'd like you to stay, as long as you want." Jonah didn't answer right away. He stood, stepped down into the dirt, and untied something from his saddle. A rolled-up cloth. When he opened it on the porch table, Lydia gasped. "A small bag of seeds. Tomlin Crane had them," Jonah said. "Traded them for land stolen from folks like you." "Why bring them back?" "Because justice isn't just what you take away from the wrong, it's what you return to the right." They planted them the next morning, side by side. 10 children laughing nearby, the wind soft, the earth rich with second chances, and the woman with the cut hair, the one they thought they'd broken. She stood taller than ever, because sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it looks like roots in good soil, and hands that don't let go. Spring came early that year. Rain visited often, gentle and generous, and the soil Jonah and Lydia planted bloomed like it had waited for the right hands to wake it. Vegetables grew strong, chickens fattened up, and laughter returned to the porch every evening, where 10 children piled around their mother, and the quiet gunslinger who never tried to replace their father, but who always showed up when they needed someone to stand tall. Jonah had made a bed for himself in the barn, though Lydia had long since offered him space inside. He stayed there not out of pride, but patience. There was a rhythm to healing, and he respected it more than most. One day, while chopping wood near the south field, Jonah spotted 3 riders on the ridge. Not enemies, travelers. Their horses were lean, tired, and their faces drawn thin from road wear. A man and 2 women, one of them clutching a baby to her chest. They weren't bandits. They weren't dangerous. They were running from danger. Jonah motioned for them to come down, and when Lydia stepped outside and saw the group, her instincts took over, just like they had when her own children were still trembling from what had been done to them. She brought out bread, water, and blankets without asking for names, because she didn't need a reason to show mercy. She just remembered what it was like to be forgotten. That night, the man, a wiry rancher named Clay, confessed through tears that his home had been seized by a group using the same broken spur brand Jonah had chased down weeks before. Some had scattered. Others had taken up new leadership under a man called Ralston Pike, a crueler, meaner echo of the men Jonah had already stopped. "He's worse," Clay said, staring into the fire. "Smiles when he hurts people, and he's headed this way." Jonah didn't speak, but his jaw set like stone. Lydia watched him, watched the stillness settle in his shoulders. And that night, after the guests had gone to sleep in the barn loft, she walked beside him under the stars. "You're going, aren't you?" she asked softly. "I can't let him get here," Jonah said. "Not to you, not to the kids, not to anyone else." Her voice trembled, not with fear but with the weight of understanding. "Then let me give you something before you do." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small strip of fabric, faded but familiar, from the dress she had worn the day her home was attacked. "This was part of what they tried to destroy," she said. "Take it with you, not for vengeance but for reminder." Jonah took it slowly, like accepting a sacred thing. And he didn't promise he'd return. He simply said, This time they'll know my name before I ride in. Word traveled ahead of him. The gunslinger who stood for widows. The man who didn't speak often but shot straight. The quiet justice. They called him the man with the widow's cloth. And by the time he reached Ralston Pike's hideout, they were already afraid. Not because of the bullets, but because they had heard he never missed when he rode for someone he loved. Dawn broke over the canyons like fire. Jonah Calhoun rode alone, again, down into the lowlands where Pike's men had holed up. The cloth Lydia had given him was tied to his left wrist, faded and frayed, fluttering in the morning wind like a silent flag. Not of war, of purpose. He didn't ride with fury. He rode with clarity. He knew this wasn't just about Pike. It wasn't even about revenge anymore. This was about making sure no other woman woke up surrounded by ash, with children crying and justice nowhere in sight. Pike's gang had grown. Rough men with slick smiles and stolen badges, hired guns with no code. Jonah counted at least 15 posted near the old mining town they'd taken as their base, once called Harrow's Edge, now called nothing at all. He waited until dusk, watched their patterns, marked their blind spots, noticed who drank too much, who slept too deep, and who looked over their shoulder too often. He didn't plan a massacre. He planned a message. That night, the first fire went up in the armory, lit from the outside, controlled, but brilliant enough to cause panic. As Pike's men scrambled, Jonah moved through the shadows like wind through pine. Quiet. Precise. One by one, he disabled their rifles, released their horses, cut the ropes to the lookout tower. Not killing, disarming, until Pike stood alone, blinking into the chaos, his silver pistol drawn, eyes searching the dark. Then Jonah stepped out from the shadows, hat low, cloth on his wrist glinting in the firelight. "You know who I am," he said. Pike sneered. "You're one man." Jonah cocked his head. That's all it takes when a man knows what he stands for. The duel wasn't fast. It was controlled. Jonah didn't aim to kill, but he didn't aim to miss either. One shot to the hand, one to the leg. Pike fell to the dust, yelling, swearing, helpless. Jonah walked slowly to him, holstering his weapon. "Tell the next man who thinks he can take from women like her," he said, voice steady, "that I'm not the only one watching anymore." Then he turned his back and walked away, and not a single one of Pike's men dared follow. By the time the sun rose, Harrow's Edge was silent, and Jonah Calhoun was already on the trail home, the cloth around his wrist stained with sweat, dust, and the proof that justice doesn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it wears memory. Back on the homestead, Lydia stood in the doorway again. She had watched the sky for days, not with fear, with faith. And when she saw that silhouette on the ridge, horse slow, rider upright, her heart whispered what her lips couldn't say aloud. He came back. Not for glory, not even for her, but because some men, when they love deeply, carry it like a compass, and it always points them home. Jonah didn't speak much when he returned. He stepped down from the saddle, slower than usual, dust clinging to his coat, a new tear in his shirt where a bullet had grazed too close. But his eyes found Lydia's, and everything else disappeared. She didn't rush to him, didn't cry, didn't need to. She just opened the gate, walked to where he stood, and touched his face, fingers light, reverent, as if to confirm what she already knew. He'd kept his word, and he'd come home. That night, they sat side by side on the porch as a warm wind moved through the fields. The children slept inside, safe and full, life returning to a place where death once waited. Jonah nursed a shallow wound, and Lydia wrapped it herself. She didn't flinch at the blood. She'd seen worse, lived worse. "What happened out there?" she asked softly. "They won't be coming back," he said. "And the sheriff in Elmsford is ready to listen now. Turns out a badge still means something, if someone reminds them what it's for." She smiled faintly. "You always had a way of reminding people." He turned to her then, searching her face as if he were reading something deeper than skin, something beneath the years, the scars, the grief. "Are you afraid?" he asked. "Not anymore," she whispered. "Not when I know what I've survived. Not when I know who I've let stand beside me." Jonah exhaled, a breath like letting go of decades. "I don't want to keep riding." "Then stop." "I don't want to sleep in a barn anymore." "Then don't." She reached for his hand, and this time he didn't hesitate, and neither did she. The next morning, Jonah moved his few belongings into the spare room. No one made a speech. No one needed to say what was already understood by every soul in that house. He wasn't just visiting. He was staying, not as a hired hand, not as a protector, but as family. Weeks passed. Crops thickened. A new fence rose. A second garden was planted. Jonah taught the children how to track weather, read wind patterns, sharpen blades, not just for defense, but for life. Lydia began to sing again. Low songs while stirring stew, humming while hanging laundry. The children noticed, and one evening her eldest daughter, Ruth, whispered to Jonah, "She sings when she's happy. She used to hum when Pa was alive." Jonah didn't say a word. But that night, as Lydia stood on the porch watching the stars, he wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and said, "You deserve to sing every day." And she answered, not with words, but by leaning into him, quiet, full-hearted, because some healing doesn't sound like thunder. It sounds like a voice rediscovered after years of silence. Autumn rolled in like an old friend, bringing with it cool evenings, crisp air, and a peace that felt hard-earned. The trees around the Lark homestead turned gold, their leaves drifting slow and gentle, like the world itself had learned to breathe again. Inside the farmhouse, Lydia pulled out a bundle of fabric scraps she'd tucked away for years. They were pieces of everything. The hem of the dress she wore the day Jonah arrived. The shirt Ruth had outgrown the winter before. A square cut from one of Jonah's old coats, worn thin at the elbows. And one faded ribbon that had belonged to her late husband, Clyde. She began stitching at night after the children were asleep, hands steady, movements certain. Each piece was a memory, each line of thread a decision to move forward. Jonah found her sewing late one night, candle flickering low beside her. "You making something for winter?" he asked, leaning in the doorway, arms crossed. "No," she said without looking up. "Something for us." He walked over, kneeling beside the table. His eyes scanned the fabric in her lap. "It's beautiful," he said softly. Lydia nodded. "I've made quilts all my life. For friends, for neighbors, but never one for myself. Not one that told my story." Jonah glanced at the center panel, a deep brown square bordered in red stitching. "What's that one?" he asked. She looked down at it, a faint smile forming on her lips. "That one's from the blanket we wrapped around you the night you came back. I thought it belonged to the barn. Turns out it belonged here." Jonah's hand brushed hers, gently. "No rush." "Have you named it yet?" he asked. Lydia nodded slowly. "I think I'll call it the Turning." "Why?" "Because it's where everything started to turn again," she said. "Where I stopped surviving and started living." By early December, the quilt was finished. Thick, warm, heavy with memory. She placed it at the foot of her bed, not just hers anymore, and told the children it was not to be used roughly. It was to be respected. "This one," she told them, "reminds me I'm not what the world tried to take. I'm what I chose to rebuild." That winter, the family didn't just survive, they thrived. Neighbors came by more often. Lydia started teaching the local women how to stitch. Jonah built a small schoolhouse beside the creek, and when the county finally sent a teacher, Ruth and her siblings were the first to sign their names on the roll. And sometimes, when the nights grew quiet and the stars hung heavy above the plains, Jonah would read aloud by firelight while Lydia leaned into his side, her short hair soft against his shoulder, her eyes closed, her fingers resting on the hem of that old quilt. No one would ever erase what had happened, but no one could take what had been grown afterward either. Love, justice, and a woman who, when given a choice between bitterness and hope, chose to sew her story into warmth. The snow came late that winter, thick flakes falling like hushes from heaven, covering the land in a softness that made even the broken fences and weathered posts look new again. The world slowed down, and inside the farmhouse, so did life. Lydia stirred stew in the cast-iron pot while the youngest children drew pictures on scraps of brown paper near the hearth. Jonah sat sharpening tools by the window, always watching, calm, not paranoid, just aware. He had learned that the world didn't always stay quiet for long. That evening, just before dusk, a rider appeared in the distance. Alone, no dust trail, no threat in his posture. But something about him made Jonah straighten in his chair. The man introduced himself as Thomas Hatch, a circuit judge from out east, traveling by request to bring news. He didn't come for trouble. He came with a letter. It was addressed to Jonah, handwritten, sealed in wax. Jonah opened it slow, the way you open something from another life. Lydia stood nearby, not reading over his shoulder, but watching his face for anything that might shift. He read it once, then again, and said nothing, not until the judge had gone. That night, Lydia waited until the children were asleep before she asked, "Is it from someone who knew you before all this?" Jonah nodded. "It's from someone who remembers what I used to be." "Does it change anything?" He folded the letter carefully, placed it into the drawer beneath the oil lamp. "It asks if I'll testify in a trial next spring, against men I used to ride with before I became who I am now." Lydia sat beside him, her voice quiet. "Will it put you in danger?" "Maybe," he admitted. "But some truths don't belong in the dark anymore." She touched his hand, fingers worn and warm. "Then we'll face it together." Jonah looked at her, really looked. "You're not afraid?" "I've been through worse without you," she said. I can face anything with you." A few days later, Lydia began writing her own letter, this one addressed to a woman who once lived in fear and silence. To herself, "Dear me, you once thought you were alone. You once thought your strength had a limit. But now you know better. Now you have hands to hold, a home that breathes, and a man who didn't save you. He stood beside you until you saved yourself. The world did not break you. It revealed you, and you were more than they ever expected." With grace, Lydia Ray Calhoun. It was the first time she had signed her name that way, not as a mark of ownership, but as a truth freely chosen. Spring came in a hush, like it respected what the land had endured. The creek thawed, the trees budded again, and for the first time in many years, the Lark homestead didn't just survive the winter, it flourished through it. The children grew stronger. Ruth began teaching the little ones to read by the front window every morning. Jonah built a new swing under the cottonwood tree, and even carved initials into it when no one was looking. L+J. Small, modest, honest. And Lydia? Lydia no longer waited for fear. She planned now. She planted rows of green beans farther than ever before. She wrote in the evenings, journals, letters, even poetry sometimes. And when she stood at the front porch, hands on her hips, sun hitting her hair, she looked like someone who had remembered who she truly was. Not a widow, not a victim, but a builder of something lasting. The trial date came. Jonah packed light. Just a clean shirt, a hand-carved cross for luck, and the piece of cloth Lydia had given him when he rode out to face Pike's gang. He didn't ask her to come, and Lydia didn't ask him to stay. But before he left, she took his hand, pressed her forehead to his chest, and said, "Speak truth, walk proud, and don't forget, this place is yours too." Jonah kissed her forehead gently. "I never forget." The trial lasted 6 days. Jonah's testimony was honest, steady, unshaken. He named names, faced the men who once called him brother, and when asked why he had walked away from that life, he didn't talk about guilt. He talked about Lydia, about the 10 children who still laughed, about a woman who didn't need saving, but who made room in her world for a broken man who wanted to heal. "She didn't forgive me because I deserved it," he said. "She forgave me because she chose to live differently." His words echoed through the courtroom like scripture. He returned on the 7th day. The children raced to him as soon as they saw the shape of his horse on the road. Lydia stood on the porch, arms crossed, but tears already warming her eyes. He didn't say much when he arrived. He just stepped down, took her in his arms, and held her like a man who understood the weight of what he'd left and the miracle of what he'd come home to. "They sentenced them," he whispered into her hair. "And you?" she asked softly. "They thanked me," he said, "but I didn't do it for thanks." She leaned back to look him in the eyes. "I know." Then after a pause, she added, "I saved some soup." He smiled. "I always come back for your soup." That night, the fire in the hearth crackled as it always had. The children slept under blankets stitched with stories. And Lydia laid her hand atop Jonah's heart, quiet, steady, grateful. And in the quiet he whispered, "I'm not going anywhere again, Lydia. I'm done running." She answered without opening her eyes, "You never had to run, you just had to belong." Because that's what healing really is. Not forgetting what hurt, but remembering who stayed, and building something warm enough to last long after the fire goes quiet. Years passed, not in a blur, but in small golden increments. The children grew tall, voices deepening, shoulders broadening, laughter louder. The homestead flourished. New animals, more rows of crops, a new well dug by Jonah's hand and blessed with Lydia's careful care. People came to visit now, not out of pity but for wisdom, because word had spread of the woman with short, silver-threaded hair who had raised 10 children, rebuilt a home from ashes, and welcomed a gunslinger into her heart without asking for anything but truth. They called her Miss Lydia in town, though many said it with reverence, like speaking of a legend who was still very much alive. One summer morning, a young woman came to the gate, dust on her shoes, a letter in her hand, and a familiar look in her eyes, a mixture of fear, strength, and something still burning beneath it all. Lydia saw it right away. She brought the girl inside, gave her tea, and listened. The woman had been left by a husband who'd taken everything, except the baby growing inside her. She had nowhere to go, but someone had told her, "There's a place west of the ridge where a woman named Lydia teaches folks how to stand again." Lydia didn't ask for details. She simply placed a hand on the girl's and said, "Then you're already halfway there." Jonah returned from town that evening and saw the girl helping Ruth in the garden. He raised a brow at Lydia as they walked side by side near the fence. "We taking in strays again?" he asked with a half smile. Lydia chuckled. "We're not taking anyone in, we're making room. He nodded, quiet. Then after a beat, "You ever think we were meant to become this?" She looked out at the field where the children had once played, now growing wheat. At the old swing beneath the cottonwood, still carving arcs in the breeze. At the small, handmade sign by the front gate, painted by Ruth when she turned 12. "Calhoun Farm, S by heart, not blood." "I didn't think we'd become this," Lydia said at last. "I chose to." Jonah smiled, and I followed. That night, Lydia sat at the table and opened her quilt chest. Not the one she slept under, but the one she saved for those like the girl on her porch. Survivors, wanderers, women who still had fire in their bones but had forgotten how to warm themselves with it. She unfolded a new piece of fabric. It was soft, light blue, and had belonged to one of Jonah's old shirts, the first he wore when he'd returned from the trial. She stitched it beside the faded ribbon from her first husband, the dress from the day she met Jonah, and the cloth from the baby blanket of her youngest. Then she paused, and for the first time, stitched her own name right in the center, Lydia Ray Calhoun. Not hidden, not small. Centered, whole, enough. Because the world didn't define her by what was taken. She was remembered by what she chose to build. And in the West, where winds erase many names, hers was one that stayed, not carved in stone, but sewn into hearts. Summer eased into autumn once more, like an old rhythm returning to its chorus. The leaves began to curl amber and red. The air grew crisp in the early mornings, and Lydia found herself waking before the rooster just to enjoy the quiet. The kind of quiet that wasn't empty, but earned. Jonah still rose early, too, though his steps had slowed slightly. His hair was more silver now than gunmetal gray, but he still fixed fences when no one asked him to, and still carved wooden animals for the grandchild that Ruth had brought into the world the previous spring. The house had changed. It had grown. A second room added out back, a proper kitchen table with benches long enough to seat all 10 children plus their families. The porch had been reinforced with wider beams, and 2 new rocking chairs sat beside the old ones. But some things remained just as they had always been. Jonah's hat still hung on the same hook by the door. The quilt Lydia stitched still covered their bed, and every evening they sat together in the fading light, saying little, needing even less. One evening Jonah came out with something in his hand, a small box, carved from pine and worn smooth by years of holding on to it. Lydia raised a brow as he handed it to her. She opened it slowly and smiled. Inside was the cloth, the one she had given him years ago, the same one tied to his wrist the day he rode out for justice. She lifted it gently, eyes soft. "I thought you might have lost this," she said. "I almost did," he replied. "But I always found my way back to it, like I found my way back to you." Lydia folded it again, not to hide it, but to hold it close. Then Jonah said, "I've been thinking about carving a sign." She looked over, amused. "Another one? What'll it say this time?" He paused, smiled, then said, "Where the fire didn't win." Lydia blinked once, heart catching in the space between breaths. Then she whispered, "That's exactly what this place became." That night, the grandkids played near the barn, laughter floating like bird song across the field. One of the youngest, a girl with Lydia's sharp eyes and Jonah's quiet stare, climbed onto the porch steps and asked, "Grandma, is it true you were almost gone once?" Lydia leaned forward, brushing a hand through the girl's hair. "I was never gone," she said gently. "I was just waiting for someone to remind me who I really was." "And who was that?" Lydia looked at Jonah, then at the field they had built, then back at the child, smiling. "A woman who didn't burn, a mother who still had more to give, and a heart no one could steal." The sun dipped behind the horizon. Jonah reached for her hand and Lydia didn't hesitate. She never had to hesitate again. Because some stories don't end in fire. They end on a porch, with love beside you, peace within you, and a world finally quiet enough to say, "You made it." 20 years later, after Lydia Ray Calhoun passed peacefully in her sleep, the farmhouse remained, weathered, strong, and full of stories in the wood grain. Her children gathered, now with silver at their temples and children of their own. Jonah, older but still steady, sat quietly in the rocking chair on the porch, holding her last quilt in his lap, the one she finished just a few weeks before her final breath. It was stitched with a message in the corner, simple, unadorned, and entirely her. "If you're reading this, then you lived long enough to keep loving." That's all I ever hoped for. In the attic, Ruth and her youngest sister found a small cedar chest. Inside were folded letters, one for each of her children, and one, marked in Lydia's familiar hand, "To the woman I used to be." Ruth unfolded it with care, reading aloud by the light of a single oil lamp, surrounded by family. "You thought the world ended the day they tried to take everything, but it didn't, because your fire kept burning, even in the ash. You met a man who didn't save you. He reminded you how to stand taller. And you chose him not because he was perfect, but because he stayed when you didn't ask him to. You raised 10 children with empty hands and a full heart. You rebuilt a home on bones and blessings. You sang again. You stitched your grief into warmth. And one day, you let love come in quietly and stay without asking for proof. You didn't just survive, you made something so strong it outlived you. So if you're ever afraid again, just look at your hands. They tell the story better than anyone else ever could. With grace, Lydia Ray Calhoun. Outside, Jonah sat still, the breeze brushing through the cottonwoods, his hand resting over Lydia's final quilt. He didn't weep, he smiled, because he knew this love wasn't buried. It was sown into the land, into the hearts of everyone she'd touched, and into the silence of each evening that followed. Years later, folks would still visit the Calhoun place, some for comfort, some for guidance, all for hope. And in the parlor, hung on the wall where Lydia's chair once sat, was a wooden sign carved by Jonah's own hand. Where the fire didn't win,